Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us at webinar number 4 of Strategy International for this year, 2022, which is the last webinar that is going to be held for this year, at least, from Strategy International. We thank you very much for being here. Along these lines, please visit strategyinternational.org to see more of our work with regards to our publications, our podcasts, our webinars, our political statements, and hopefully soon to come, our web TV. We are very glad that we are having you among us, and we hope that you're going to listen from us on and about very simple but important subjects around the world. Today, we have the opportunity to have with us 2 distinguished friends and fellows at 2 different universities, from which I'm going to give the floor to introduce themselves before we start. But allow me to say that Strategy International is exactly here in order to connect the dots and in order to do both the consulting and the think tank in the globe. We're based out of Cyprus, the Republic of Cyprus, in the European Union, but at the same time, we are seeking global impact and global information to what is happening around the world. I know that there is a lot of interest about Latin America, and I thought to give you some of the 2 very best and more acquainted people with this regard, that both have experience because of their nativeness or their science, or because of their science and abilities. I have had the pleasure to work with both of them, and I look forward for more distinguished work. And I'll just be presenting to you today Dr. Haniel David Melades Visbal and Dr. Mohamed Badin El Yatiwi. I know that Dr. Haniel is from Colombia, and he's actually right now in the European continent. So thank you very much, Dr. Haniel, for joining us. And also Dr. Mohamed Badin, who's in the Emirates at this point in Dubai. And we also have Dr. Joseph Demerdzis, as some of you may know him already. He's our research director at Strategy International. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. I'll give the floor first to Dr. Haniel. Maybe he can say a few words about him, and Dr. Mohamed, and then we can start a discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mario. It's a great pleasure to see you again. Joseph, Mohamed, was also an honor to share this webinar with you. I work as assistant professor at the Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. I am also the director of the Citizen Security Observatory, which is soon to become the Center for Analysis in Violence, Security, and Defense. I have been working on subjects related to Latin America, geopolitical interest in the region, but also Middle East, North Africa, and I'm happy to be here with you. My main focus or my main interests are actually based on security matters. So I'll guess that during our conversation, security will arise as a main subject of interest in Latin America also.
Absolutely, Haniel. It's imperative that we talk about security, and today we're going to have the opportunity to hear both a description and an analysis of your choice with regard to Latin America, why Latin America matters, what are the subjects at hand that we need to pay attention, how is the political and financial world going along, and where do we stand with regards to options, but also opportunities. But before we go to the discussions, I'll leave the floor also to Dr. Mohamed so she can introduce himself.
Thank you, Dr. Marius. Thank you for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, with Dr. Haniel, with Dr. Joseph, and with all of the people who are listening to us. I'm Dr. Mohamed Badin El Yatiwi. I'm Assistant Professor of International Affairs and Strategy, and also Program Director of a Master in Diplomacy in the College of Security and Global Studies in the American University in the Emirates, where I had the pleasure to work with Dr. Marius during 1 year. I'm really glad for this invitation. I spent 5 years in Mexico, in the University of the Americas. I worked with also many public universities and public center for research in this country. I was also some months in Colombia, some months in Cuba. My PhD dissertation was about the relations between the United States and Latin America. And my research had a focus on Mexico, Colombia, and Venezuela. I'm still working on Latin America. Now I'm trying to work more about the relations between the MENA countries, Middle East and North Africa, with Latin America, especially Morocco, Turkey, Iran, to try to analyze what they are doing or what they are trying to do with these countries, and also the challenges and the limitations.
Very good. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. And it is always a pleasure to have you on board. I know that I've learned a lot of things from you with regards to Latin America, although it's not my specialty. But here we are, Dr. Haniel. You're from Colombia. You're a good friend. We spent some good times together. And it is an opportunity to let us know why Latin America matters. I mean, it is a post-World Cup. Congratulations to Argentina. I mean, I was with France, but Argentina got it. How does this impact? Which I'm definitely sure that somehow it also impacts not only Argentina but also Latin America. The politics of sports, the trade, the elements. What is at stake? We've seen elements. Things are happening in Peru, which are unforeseen at this point. Similarly, Argentina has financial and political problems as well. Colombia has also challenges. There is also the elections of President Lula, who got also the presidency also in Brazil once more. Give us just just an overview to just start with on Latin America, please.
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. Well, let me begin with just stating that Latin American political landscape, it's been, if you want to call it, quite dramatic. Colombia, for example, and Brazil had these nail-biting and course-altering elections, meaning the comeback of Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, and the election of Gustavo Petro in Colombia as the first leftist government in the country. But not only that, in Colombia, Petro is a very, you might call it polarizing figure if you want. He is a former AIM-19 guerrilla commander who demobilized 30 years ago when this guerrilla group signed a peace treaty with the Colombian government. He later became a congressman and Bogotá's mayor, so he adopted the democratic rules to obtain power, and he eventually did. But still, it's considered a very polarizing figure. So you can find also some instability, which has deepened a lot in the recent weeks in Peru. You have Dina Boluarte, who became the country's fifth president in the last 2 years after Pedro Castillo attempted to dissolve the Congress in an auto coup. We have some, if you want to call it also, democratic backsliding in Central America, for example, with El Salvador, with President Bukele, also with Honduran President Castro, who recently suspended a number of constitutional rights in the capital in order to combat criminal gangs. So you have a lot of, if you want to call it, a mixture of elements that are presenting the Latin American continent political landscape in some sort of instability kind of scenario. And if you add this, the fact that we're still trying to recover from the situation presented with the pandemic, looking ahead, the region can expect, from my personal point of view, some continuation of this stability with a very, very slow recovery from an economic point of view. So if you put these elements together, it's likely to have public discontent, not so much high rating approvals ratings from the region's leaders right now. So we're still finding our way now that this 2022 is coming to an end in order to come back as a region with enormous importance for the world.
Okay. From what I've taken, I mean, I think that as a starting point, I think Dr. Mohammed should also add his value and then just take it on from there as a subject to subject, probably. And I think, you know, once Dr. Mohammed finishes, I'll just start with one of the most recent things, which is the environmental decisions and how these impact Latin America. And I know it does because of one of the biggest forest, I mean, the biggest forest, the Amazon. And how does this impact with regards to the protection of the wildlife and biodiversity? But I'll come back to this. Dr. Mohammed, what you're saying into this?
Look, the impact of the victory of Argentina in the World Cup is really important for the Argentinians, not for all the region. Now the situation in this country especially is really difficult because they have an economic crisis, really high inflation. Argentina, you know, is a strange country because they have an economic growth and at the same time an inflation and more poverty. So it's something interesting and really sad at the same time. And also you have some competition or some fights between the President Fernandez and the Vice President Fernandez, but they are not from the same family, between Cristina and Alberto, because Cristina Fernandez is the former president and she is trying to maintain political influence, and also because at an ideological level, they have some differences between them. We have Alberto Fernandez, the president, who is trying to negotiate with IMF because of the debt and because of all these problems that Argentina is suffering for more than 2 decades now. And Cristina, she wants more support to the population, to the poor people, especially after COVID-19. So we have also this problem. We had also a minister of economy and finance who resigned during the summer. So it's really difficult. And for them to obtain this victory, especially after 36 years during the World Cup, helped also the economy, because during this month of World Cup, you had some economic sectors, especially all that is related to coffees, restaurants, etc., that were very happy. And it's also interesting to see, to establish the priorities, because when you see how many Argentinians were in Qatar, you can imagine that some of them did not have the resources to do it, and they had to sell their personal things to go. So this is for Argentina, and the political competition, and also right-wing political parties that are in total opposition with the government. You don't have a lot of negotiations and cooperation in the Congress between them, and Cristina Fernandez is also the president of the Senate, so it's a little bit complicated. Regarding the other countries, we have, you mentioned the case of Peru, really interesting what is happening with Castillo, who tried to take all the power and finally finished with 0 power and in jail. So this is interesting. The case of Colombia, Dr. Haniel knows it really well. It's something interesting to see a left-wing president, because it never happened in Colombia, and it was an exception for all people working on Latin America. 10 years ago, if you would have asked to someone, do you think that one day the Colombians will have a left-wing president, former guerrillero from M19, will tell you it's impossible. So now it happened, and we have also the first vice president, Francia Marquez, who is coming from the Afro-Colombian part of the society. So it's also really symbolic, but they have to fight against a big economic crisis that Ivan Duque could not do anything against that. A lot of problems of security also who are coming back in Colombia. So it will be interesting to see how Petro will do it. Boric in Chile, he's fighting also against the opposition. He lost the referendum in September about the new constitution. We have to mention that the constitution in Chile is the constitution that Pinochet led them in 1990 when he left the power. So we are still with the same constitution. Boric tried to implement a new constitution, but the referendum was no, a clear no, 62%. So now he's working with some political parties, except far right, to try to establish a new constitution, because it's something important for him also to implement some social changes, not only political changes, and it's linked with some things related to the constitution. So we have many different cases, and the problem that always existed in Latin America is, for the Europeans, it's really clear. You have one institution, the European Union, with a lot of institutions inside, but you have only one thing. In the case of Latin America, you have 1 million regional agreements, you have 1 million regional institutions, but you don't have a lot of coherency and efficiency regarding the national interest, the competition between leaders, between countries. And it will be also interesting to see how Lula, with his comeback, impressive comeback, difficult but impressive comeback, will manage all of that. And just to conclude, to continue with some other topics, when in Europe and in general, especially in Europe, when we are analyzing Latin America, they say, it's a comeback of the left-wing parties, left-wing leaders. I think it's more complicated than that, because it's difficult to compare Lula and Maduro, to compare Petro and Boric. You have national scenarios, national challenges, and also national political history, who explain that they are in reality really different between Castillo and Boric, and also regarding what is happening in Peru. For example, Mexico, Bolivia, Colombia are supporting Castillo, but Lula and Boric in Chile are supporting the opposition, saying that it's a coup or a tentative of auto-coup. So it's really interesting, and when you go deep in the details, you can see that it's really complex, Latin America.
I dare to ask now, Dr. Haniel, but is it true that, what Dr. Mohammed says, that, no leftist is related with him? I mean, we have a very good Venezuela, which has been doing quite well recently, and it seems that Joe Biden was even negotiating with them at a time for their energy importance, no matter if the United States is doing is doing business with Europe. But, is it true that they may be leftists, but they do not relate with each other, at least not ideologically or something like that?
Yeah, it is true. I mean, you can find some temporary ideological alignment between governments in Latin America, but there's still a lot of there are a lot of challenges that are not going to promote, a deep probably integration and coordination of all of them in several areas, which are quite different depending on the country of your election. So, for example, now that you mentioned Venezuela, it's interesting to say so. But recently, I'm sorry, I still working on my English. I'm a little jet lagged, so I apologize that you have to cope with my terrible Tony Montana accent, but I'll try to do my best. But recently, between Colombia and Venezuela, relationships were not that close. Mohammed mentioned the government of Ivan Duque, which was very kind of against the Maduro regime. And now we have the Petro era, if you want to call it that way. And it's quite interesting to find the fact that Colombia and Venezuela are reestablishing relations. Everybody thought, not everybody, but like most of the analysts, a lot of people on the social or areas of the country thought that Petro was going to be, like Maduro's best new friend. That he was going to be like all in for Venezuela. Is going to be supportive in Venezuela. Is going to be, very close to the regime. And at certain points, Petro has shown some sort of political rationale that has come to the fact that, but by some degree, he is moving forward to closer relations with Venezuela. I mean, the border is open, economic trade is moving there. It's quite slow yet. It's been a couple of months since we had this reestablishment of diplomatic missions here and there, but it's getting there. But also at the same time, you also have a Colombian government which has been quite critic with the Venezuelan regime in other areas. And now it's, for example, one subject which was very controversial last year, for example, and was at the center of popular mobilization here in Colombia. It was the fact that the subject of Colombia like modernizing its air force, buying combat planes. It was a very tough issue during the political tension of the last year, especially with the economic tensions lived throughout the region, but especially in Colombia. And now Petro, which was one of the main critics of that decision by Duque, which was not implemented afterwards, but was presented by him. Now he is retaking this subject in order to go forward and to actually fulfill that modernization of the Colombian air capacity in order to protect what you can call, sovereignty. And how this relates with the Venezuela government, I'm sure the Maduro regime is watching carefully which decision is going to be making Colombia in this area in particular. So I just want to conclude that when you mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, Mario, why Latin America matters, it matters because of the regional landscape and the impact it has worldwide. And one of the reasons why it matters is for geopolitical reasons also. And I think we are going to move forward that direction. But I just want to state it that way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I just want to add here the importance of demographics as well, exports and imports, but I think we're going to cover this in the real next subjects to come. Mohammed, one of the very important things that happened throughout last week was that Canada actually, all the United Nations member states agreed on 30% protection of the planet in its totality, which is talking about biodiversity and the need for more oxygen, more green technology, but also protection of our natural habitat, the one that remains. I'm not talking about ice melting, but I'm actually talking about the Amazon, or I'm talking about the south of Latin America, the very south of Latin America, which is also important as well, along with Latin America. How do Latin American countries react to this? And especially in this case, I would say Colombia and Brazil, but also the other countries neighboring, which are bordering, also in some of it's part of the Amazon as well. How do they react? And again, why is it important for us to know? Because we are from the other side. I mean, we're in the Middle Earth, I would say, but how important is it for us? We have the tendency to look at, studies that says 30% of the global oxygen is produced in Amazon. We lose that, we lose 30% of the oxygen. How does it feel and how does it translate for the rest of the world?
Look, I think we will have in different countries like Chile, Brazil with Lula, maybe Argentina, but I'm not sure. I will say Chile and Brazil, a big problem for the presidents, for Lula and for Boric, because one part of their supporters, one part of the civil society who supported them against the right wing did it in part for these reasons, for social reasons, economic reasons, etc., but also for that. Considering that, for example, Bolsonaro, to be honest, he didn't care about these questions. Now, the problem for Lula, for example, or for Boric, is that they are not in the opposition. They will lead the future of their country, and they will have also to deal with the private sector, with the economic sector. And the private sector and the economic sector in these two countries, and also in the rest, in Peru, in Bolivia, etc. But I'm thinking especially about these two countries. The economic sector is really important, really powerful, and also independent from the political power. And I'm not sure that the big, companies in Brazil or in Chile will accept to participate to these questions regarding environment, because it will affect directly their economic interests. So it will be interesting to see how these two presidents, but maybe some others, will deal with that, because it's totally different, and you all know that, not only for Latin America, but in general, to be in the opposition, to say we should do this, we should do that. And regarding this question of environment, we can see that in different parts of the world, when someone is elected and he's taking the lead of the government of his country, it's a little bit different, because you have to deal with some opposite and some oppositions between what you want really, and also the economic growth, especially because we are in a situation of economic crisis, inflation, etc. So it will be interesting to see how they will apply it, if it will be really 30%, if they will try to reduce it. It will be interesting to see it.
Okay.
I would like to add something.
Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with Mohammed. I just would like to add that taking in consideration this environmental concern, I think Latin America is a region that is going to become more prominent, a more prominent area of interest, especially on debates, related with climate change and deforestation. And he was talking about Brazil recently, for example. It's interesting to mention that Lula recently signaled that he would like to host the COP into 2025, I'm sorry. And if you take that in consideration, take the BRICS and the G20 summits in 2024, it becomes clear that Lula administration is going to have a significant impact in order to, signal that Brazil is somehow back, and to expect Brazilian more active participation, and Latin America in general, but mostly Brazilian, because as you probably know, but the Amazon is huge, but it's divided among several countries within the region. Colombia is one, Brazil is the other, Peru another one, but the main part of it is in Brazil. So this is going to probably take Brazil to a next level among the global debate on climate change.
Yeah, it's very interesting you said about COP 29 probably, but COP 30 or something. Because COP 28 is going to be next year in Abu Dhabi. But I was going into this to translate that, deforestation is a very lucrative business with regards to exports of wood into the world. And, for those attendees that are joining us today, one of the things that is very important to stress is that natural resources are now scarce, more scarce than ever before. That includes also wood. And to show you how important this is, the Ukraine-Russia war has very much to do so also with wood and the export of wood. And that makes the Brazilian wood, or the Latin American wood in general, if you want to call it like this, more expensive because of the scarcity of the amounts that it comes. At the same time, the environmental protection, it seems that costed the chairmanship and the presidency of the former president of Brazil, for example, who was accused multiple times of not protecting the source of oxygen. And we're waiting to see what Lula is gonna do. And probably it would be probably probably expected that he would play the environmental card, because it seems that it is one of the most serious cards that Lula has a very good name in the United Nations with regards to projects that reflect biodiversity, protection of biodiversity, and all the programs that were here with regards to industrialization or protection of the industry in terms of the environmental elements. But we will see more to this. I just wanted to use this opportunity to just go deeper on this subject. And I'll go, before I go to actual, warlike and security situations, I want to see and understand and make people understand how important is global trade, considering all these occurrences that are taking place right now. We've seen the Arab world, for example, being exactly more positively aggressive towards direct trade with Latin America. There was in 2019 a final agreement between the European Union and Mercosur, for example, in its totality in 2019 for direct trade with the European Union. This puts in all of it, all like South and Latin America all together in the prime spot for global trade. What are we to see? How important is this with regard to culture and trade relations? I would go with Mohammed Badim, but only if your camera is on, we cannot see you. Otherwise, I'll go with Dr. Haniel and then I'll come back there.
No problem. Sorry, it was my alarm. I was just thinking about your question, and it's something really interesting to see the evolution, because if we make a little bit of history really shortly, the pressure was coming from the US in the 80s and the 90s, saying to the Latin American countries, you should accept the free trade agreements. Especially you had one big project called the FTAA, the Free Trade Agreement for the Americas, who was a big project. And finally, you had strong oppositions from many countries of Latin America, and it never existed. Finally, the only Latin American country who signed a free trade agreement with the United States and Canada is Mexico, with a NAFTA and the new version in 2018. So it's interesting to see how these countries, developed bilateral relations with the US regarding free trade. But regarding multilateral agreements, Mexico is the only one, and Mexico is a little bit considered as a little bit different, we can say, in the region now. So it's something really interesting to see how they push, and it's also interesting to see now how China is taking a big advantage on that, and it's not the US. So we had the famous Doctrine Monroe. Next year, in 2 weeks, we will celebrate the 200 years. But in reality, the country who had more benefit, who have more benefits of this idea of global trade, of free trade agreements, etc., is China. It's not the United States. So it's something really interesting. And if we come back to Argentina, I think, is one of the countries where the civil society is more and more in opposition with these global trade agreements, because you have strong trade unions in Argentina. It's related to their history. And you have a big gap, I think, in Latin America. I don't know what Dr. Haniel think about that, between the elite, the economic elite of these countries from the private sector, or also some technocrats from government, and the civil society. You have a big difference about how they see and how they analyze the impacts of the global trade.
I want to add on this. There was at some point the United States got really irritated politically and militarily, but we're not there in security. Haniel wanted, so I can pass over also the floor for Dr. Haniel to tell us his own opinion about this. But what I want to add is the following: that China, you mentioned China, is very interesting. I didn't want to go there, but now you dare me to do that. China was accused by the United States that it invests suddenly a lot of money into Argentina, especially with its own research outer space program, which would also include a similar to the SETI program. And it was seen from the United States as a program that would be a direct risk and a threat to its national security in the immediate region. I will start with this one with Dr. Haniel. I know that you're going to answer the previous question as well, but just try to add this thing a bit from your side, so we can see what they say, what people say.
Well, just a little comment on the previous things that Mohammed was talking about. I agree with him. Just to keep in mind that the region's growth is expected to be somewhere around 3.5%. So it's slightly above the global average of 3.2. Some modest recovery from the economic carnage of the pandemic. And in terms of trade and economic need, well, China, it's getting its job done in the region. Most of the Latin American countries are trading now more money and more investments. with the Chinese government, which is a major issue if you want to develop it later. Now, in terms of security and how this deals with, for example, from North American interests, is quite challenging. I mean, security, it's being related in Latin America as a main topic. Like, for example, just for the audience to have an idea, from the 50 most violent cities in the world, I mean, 43, 44 are from Latin America. Most of them are in Mexico. Colombia has 3 or 4 cities in that list. So if security is an issue that is constantly on the subject to analyze in Latin America, and it's also related with economic growth, with even migration, especially from Central American countries. So it's a subject that it's important, it's relevant, and geopolitically, you can also see that we're just next to the United States, but that's a geographical future. But in terms of geopolitical dynamics, I think that the entire region is moving now to a certain level of distance, if you want to call it that way, from traditional American influence on domestic or regional agenda.
Let me just add something, Dr. Haniel, and then I'll just continue with you, Dr. Haniel, and I'll come back to Mohammed, Dr. Mohammed. The way that we anticipate Latin America, because you went on security, and thank you for just initiating this. We dwell on 3 different subjects. One is national or homeland security, I would say. The other one is the war against drugs. And the third part is the influence that both in the 20th century and the 21st century, wars that we consider of great importance to the European or global affairs have somehow a connection with Latin America. It was seen in the 20th century, the involvement of a lot of people into this, the space. Post World War II, a lot of people just migrated, and people were, the Israeli government, for example, were chasing people in Latin America that actually got, went there. Other Middle Eastern governments actually started getting fundraising there, or their people had moved there, and so on and so forth. Massive migration occurred in the second half of the 20th century from in the initial parts from Europe to Latin America, and then suddenly in the 21st century, while we open the doors of more trade, and while technology connects us faster, we also realized a very important role that Latin America has to play, not only with trade but also in global security. So where do we stand with regard to what is happening in the world, and how does Latin America sees this? This question goes to Haniel, and then directly to Dr. Mohammed.
Yeah, well, I would like to just pinpoint, for example, the Colombia's role, for example, in drug industry. Colombia has been the main producer of cocaine, main exporter of cocaine, and it's actually responsible for around 70 to 80% of world cocaine. So there's nothing in the near future that seems to challenge this situation. And it's very important in terms of how does this Colombian reality, which might seem like a very, kind of an individual aspect for one Latin American country, has a huge global impact. For example, I could mention just former Colombian president Andrés Pastrana, who was actually very successful in presenting the Colombia situation not as a Colombian problem that is going to be suffered only by Colombians and deal with Colombians, and it has to be somehow resolved by Colombians. He was very successful in internationalizing this subject in order to obtain important resources from, for example, European community and the United States, especially with PAN Colombia, which transformed Colombia in the third most important recipient of economic resources from the American government in terms of security. After Israel and Egypt, it was Colombia with Plan Colombia, and it was initially focused only to combat drugs. And then after the situation transformed with the 9/11 terror attacks, they, like the American government, lift this some sort of limitation using these funds in order to also use them in the war on terror, which was pretty logical at the time, taking in consideration that by then Colombia already had 3 organizations considered by the State Department as international terrorist organization: FARC, ELN, and AUC. So I was just mentioning this because I wanted to highlight the importance in terms of not only a situation, a problem that is taking place in one country, but also affects the entire neighborhood. Now you have a very huge problem related to illegal narcotics. And Colombia is only one part of that. You take in consideration the Peru port to this production of cocaine, also Venezuela, and now the situation has changed dramatically because back in the 80s, back in the 90s, the times of Pablo Escobar, all these drug lords, Colombian cartels were actually taking drugs into the American streets. Now the business has changed, and we have Mexican cartels taking a more impressive role in all these logistics and taking, of course, more of the money that is, at the end of the day, provided with these illegal economies. So the situation erodes in a way that it's transforming a problem which is located in one specific country into a huge element of concern for the entire world. It's by nature a transnational activity. And I just wanted to highlight this in order to state the fact that not only Colombia, but other actors in the regional arena are becoming more relevant in terms of illegal economies, being drugs only one of that illegal economy. We have smuggling, we have anyway, it's also like money laundering. It's like an entire cycle of illegal industry that is coming to the world from our neighborhood.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed. I think it's a good time for you to connect the dots as well from both sides. I mean, I know that you have a great experience on either sides of the Atlantic in this case.
Look, what is interesting with Latin America, and especially if we try to connect security and economy. From the beginning of the 90s, the United States tried to connect both topics, security and economy. As I mentioned before, the case of, for example, the NAFTA. Mexico had some economic growth. They have some sectors who are now really strong, especially well, the industry. But the relation with the security cannot be done. With the situation in Mexico is worse than 30 years ago. When we speak, for example, about some global free trade agreements, we had one agreement called the CAFTA. So we had Central American countries, Dominican Republic, with the US. I'm not sure that the situation in Central America regarding security is better than 30 years ago. And we can see also that when you have a leader who is trying with his own way, but is not totally respecting the rule of law, he's like an opponent to the US. I'm talking about Bukele in Salvador. Yep. So we can see that for the US, if we establish a balance after 30 years, it's not a success. And the countries who are successful regarding their own criteria, but are not the criteria of Washington. So it's really interesting to see how the Latin American countries are developing their own way, good or bad. This is not the question, good or bad. Sometimes it's worse than before. But what is interesting is to see that many countries in the 19th century, their model was the United States. For example, in Argentina, if you check the constitution of 1853, it was a copy-paste of the American Constitution. They had many civil wars, fights, coup, etc. after the independence. So they say rule of law, liberal democracy, it's perfect for us. And Argentina had a lot of success at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. And after that, you have Perón, you have different coups and military coups, and everything changed. Today, if you analyze the situation in Latin America, right wing, left wing, people totally different, Bolsonaro, Lula, for example. No one of them has as a model the United States. No one will tell you, I want to copy paste the United States. And it's interesting because regarding security topics, regarding free trade agreements and economy, the United States should change their opinion or should change their analysis regarding the countries of the region. And what is interesting is to see that the think tanks, but also the political parties, Democrats, Republicans, are still looking to Latin American countries with the same eyes than 30 years ago. So this is interesting. And if we want to make a comparison, because you asked me about that, it's exactly the same if we talk about European countries and some countries that I know a lot, for example, France and the North African countries. France is still looking at North African countries of Maghreb like 30 years ago, and in reality, they changed a lot with new issues, with new challenges, etc. So it's interesting to see how powerful countries finally lost influence in the global South because they did not adapt their visions to the new realities.
Very good. Still, and somehow we have missed the part where we talk also about the European Union and how does this impact the European Union or the Middle East on this. It is something that I want to drag you into in order to see how we comprehend both in the European Union and in the Middle Eastern world or the Arab world, Latin America. How do you think, Javier, we consider Latin America in this part of the world?
Sorry, I muted myself. That's a very interesting question, Mario. But you might call it counterintuitive kind of thing going on between Latin America and Middle East. I mean, you could probably think that they're not quite related, but for example, we have huge immigration from Palestinian people, from Lebanese, especially in Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina. Security issues between governments, for example, also Colombia has been a major strategic partner with not only the United States, but also Israel due to our internal armed conflict, which is still going on, actually. For example, Venezuela, Mohammed mentioned this earlier among his research interests, which I share. For example, the relation between Iran or the penetration of Iran in Latin American continent, especially within the context of Hugo Chavez as the new elected leader of Venezuela. You know, that's like a breaking point. I don't know if Mohammed agrees with me this subject, but you can find that in a period of time, a very short period of time, probably 10, 15 years, Iranian diplomatic office in Latin America doubled, and they had the Venezuelan leader, Hugo Chavez, as a major ally in order to kind of make it like an easy way for them to enter areas from which they didn't traditionally were used to. So there are a lot of interest here in Latin America among Middle East, and I'm sure Mohammed can address this in a more specific way.
Thank you, Javier. Mohammed?
Look, regarding Chavez and Iran, it's interesting to see how in the last 15 years, Iran used Hezbollah, who is Lebanese, but is a proxy, its proxy, in Latin America, using also some elements of the Lebanese community in Venezuela, especially, but also in Peru, in Colombia, etc., etc. You have also one key actor who is Tarek Al-Aissami, who is the Minister of Energy of Venezuela, who was Minister of Energy of Venezuela during many years, really powerful, with Syrian family. You can know from the name, but he's not 100% Latino. He's born in Venezuela from a Syrian family. What is interesting is that he's not Muslim and he's not Shiite. And he's the strongest support of the Hezbollah in Iran. He's Druze. So it's also interesting, you know, to say it, because sometimes we can have some confusions. But
Yeah.
what is really interesting is to see how Chavez with Iran and also with Lula 15 years ago tried to establish like a counterpower. And what is interesting now is to see how Lula, I think this is my opinion, will try to establish a really good relation with Erdogan. I'm pretty sure of that. And it will be interesting to see how Turkey, Iran, and Brazil, maybe with Venezuela, especially if Maduro can maintain himself now with these new negotiations with the United States regarding energy since September, consequence of the war in Ukraine. It will be really interesting to see how the United States, how the European Union will react, you know, against that. Because this is another discussion that we can have, I think, for another webinar. But the role of Erdogan in the war in Ukraine is important in the mediation, we can say. But to have a good relation between Turkey and Brazil, I think it's a big challenge for many countries in the West. To have a good relations between Turkey, Brazil, Iran, and Venezuela, this can also be a big threat and a big problem for many countries. So it will be interesting to see how this time Lula will manage that. Also to see how Maduro will manage his future, because now he's in a better situation than 3 or 4 years ago, and no one was expecting that, to be honest. Guaido was in a really good situation 2018, 2019, not now. And it's also important to just to mention something before to give you the floor. It's important also to see how Mexico, the Mexican diplomacy with Marcelo Ebrard, is playing a role between the Venezuelan opposition and the Venezuelan president. This is also something really important that the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador wanted to do. And Mexico is trying to play a key role in the Venezuelan conflict, and they are trying to do the same in Peru now. But we can see that in Peru yesterday, the Minister of Foreign Affairs said that it's not possible to do that in Peru and to receive the Castillo's family in the Mexican embassy. So we are in a period of big changes, I think.
Yeah, and
I would like to. I'm sorry. I would like to add something. I think that Mohammed made a great job of presenting these arguments. I just wanted to pinpoint 3 small things. First of all, for when you mentioned the fact that this alliance between Venezuela, Iran, you know, all the international actors with relevance in the international arena, recently they conducted some sort of these war drills with troops from Iran, China, and Russia in Venezuela territory. That's something very interesting to, you know, to pay attention to. Second, you mentioned Hezbollah, and which is very traditional to relate with this 3 border area in Latin America, which is between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina, near the Falls of the Iguazu and the Iguazu Falls, which is a very complex area in terms of security. But there is also like an additional 3 border area that it's interesting to pay attention to, not the one that I mentioned before between Argentina, Brazil, and Paraguay, but between Venezuela, Colombia, and Panama, actually Maicao, Punto Fijo, and Panama. this three border area, it's also very interesting in terms of money laundering and illegal networks that are producing tons of money for Hezbollah and its associates. And the third element that I was going to mention was, I don't know, I forgot already. I don't want to take much time, but it's very interesting that we have to take in consideration this. Oh no, I remember now. I remember now that the third element is that it's interesting also to consider the fact that taking in consideration the close alliance between Venezuela and Iran. Venezuela is the only Latin American country which has a very advanced and functional drone capacities. This is very interesting to consider if you, for example, just see what is going on in Ukraine with the use of Iranian drones by the Russian military. Just those 3 points I wanted to add for.
And they connect with each other somehow, Javier. And thank you very much, and Mohammed, because we are also looking on the other side, and I think what also Mohammed said somehow makes sense, because it seems that Turkey does not have a role in the West, nor it has very good relations, although it is part of NATO in the way that it operates. Yet again, the military part of Turkey somehow is seen at NATO as a must and as a utility for them, while at the same time Turkey is trying to create its own defense industry, its own exports, and it is commonly known that, you know, with the attempt to have bigger ships, mainly in the Navy, definitely they're not for the Aegean or the Mediterranean. So it would be somehow amazing not to see any kind of Navy going into Latin America. And it seems that, like they have an African policy, Turkey had an African policy since 1994. They are seeking to have a Latin American policy. And it seems that somehow, yes, probably Lula would have good relations with Turkey eventually, because Turkey might want to become part of BRICS. So somehow it needs the finances. It also looks at the money and the people and so on and so forth. So it makes sense, but I'm not that sure that Turkey may be able to see or foresee the abilities or capabilities that Brazil may be seeking from counterparts that actually make sense. They need somebody that develops the global GDP, somebody that develops more, basically part of the G8, not the G20. Yet again, it is a bit complicated, and it seems that we've got some good information from the side, as you said, Javier, as well. The recent military drill that happened in the area of Latin America in Venezuela, it's actually really important, and it makes sense somehow. Venezuela has been a very constant leftist towards both the Soviet back then and the Chinese, but still now towards Russia and towards China. So it seems that things are moving along quite fast. It seems that a Game of Thrones is still taking place also in Latin America. The fact that there are countries seeking new alliances, more of globality, and showcases that either sides may look at communication or trade or efficient or inefficiency in their way of delivering their outcome and their policies actually matters. I will only conclude, and I'll just give the floor then to Joseph to make the first question, and I would ask also the participants if they have any question to put it in written, so they can ask 1 or 2 questions. We'll just take like 5-6 more minutes, but allow me to ask a question before, as I said, give the floor to Dr. Joseph on this one. Did COVID affect, as much it did affect trade, business, education, policy, society in Europe? How did they anticipate COVID throughout, 2020 to 2021, 2022, let's say? I mean, did they take precautions, or was it initially like the United States? Did they take part in the WHO decisions, not on the collective, but in practice? I know there was a lot of cargo flying from and to this area. How was it, Javier?
Sorry, COVID was well, a big mess around our area. If you compare, for example, with the European continent or American policies, well, you have a very, I mean, worlds of apart of the difference, which is the capacity of the federal government, for example, in the United States and several Latin American economies, crippled economies that had to deal with poor health systems, with a civil society not so willing to fulfill or comply with some of the limitations. And in terms of economic development, it set us back for a relevant amount of time. If you consider what I just mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, the expected growth of the region is slightly above the global average, and it's still very modest. I mean, the harm was done. It was like a graveyard of small companies and businesses and inflation. And if you take all that in consideration, and also add the fact that we are, I don't know how to say this in English, it's a very, it's a region with high levels of inequalities, then you have all the ingredients, you know, for a situation of social unrest. I think that's one of the main reasons that so many cases of political parties or leaders are becoming or have become the actual leaders of some of the countries. I'm talking specifically on the case of Colombia, but not only Colombia. And these circumstances, of course, are related with the COVID and the restrictions and the impact that it has, especially on economic and social and political landscapes throughout the region.
Thank you very much, Javier. Mohammed?
Which aspect do you want me to focus? Because Haniel said many interesting things.
Absolutely. The idea was COVID. How did it affect? We know the realities here. We know the realities in the Middle East. What happened in Latin America? How efficient or inefficient it was? Did actually people, did it obscure business as usual? Are we back business as usual? We saw yesterday in Argentina, more than 5 million people were walking out the street. We live in a COVID time. It does not look that people are still, thinking of it.
To be honest, I was in Mexico during the first year, 2020 of COVID, before joining the AUE in Dubai. It was a complete disaster, to be honest. I was there, so I saw what was happening. It was a big disaster. And, during the COVID period, I was between 4 countries, Mexico, France, Morocco, and UAE. So I could see different, visions and different strategies against COVID. I also wrote a book chapter. It was a comparative analysis of what Brazil and Mexico did. And you can see that it was totally different regarding not only the political context, but also the relations between the president and the governors. You have 2 federal countries, but really different strategies. In the case of Brazil, you had a President Bolsonaro who did not care about the COVID. He also had specific fights with his own government because different ministers of health resigned, different members of his cabinet resigned. You had some mayors, some governors who tried to establish a strategy and they could not. In the case of Mexico, you had something interesting. You had the subsecretary of health who was doing a press conference every day, saying, take care, it's really important, it's really dangerous, etc., etc. This subsecretary of health, no one knew him before. He was a technocrat, someone really specialized in this topic of pandemic. He tried to do his best, and it was amazing because he was doing his press conference at 7 p.m. every day. And the next day at 7 a.m., you had the press conference of the President Obrador, Mañanera. Every morning you had this press conference, and it's still existing. And he was saying exactly the opposite. So it was something amazing, when you are living in the country and you listen of the president and the subsecretary of health saying 2 things that are totally in opposition. That was amazing. And you had also in Mexico some governors who tried to not respect the decisions of the federal government in Mexico City, especially in Jalisco, Guadalajara. And Guadalajara is considered as the second city of Mexico. Always have a competition with Monterrey. In Nuevo León, Monterrey, it was the same. They were not respecting the decisions of the federal government. And you had also something that was also amazing, was to see how the cartels played a role. For example, in Baja California, Tijuana, who is the capital, or in Cancun, you know, all the touristic places, you had a strong pressure from the cartels to not close the nightclubs and the bars, because the clubs and the nightclubs and the bars are their properties. So they were still open. And what was also interesting is that I think one of the only, or maybe the only one country in the world who never asked for COVID test, never asked for vaccination is Mexico. And you had a very interesting phenomenon to see Spanish people, young Spanish people who were living the lockdown in Spain, who left Spain during 2 or 3 months, and this is not something unique. You had some really interesting videos about that, who left to Mexico without visa, without vaccination, without COVID test. They rent a house in Cancun or close to Cancun. They worked online with their companies in Spain, and because of, you know, the difference of timing, they were working, and at the same time they were doing big parties in Mexico. And it's not something, you know, 5, 10, or 20 people. We are talking about many people who did that. So it's really interesting.
That's very interesting. It's a very good closure, and I think it's a very good, you know, like it says it all together. We never thought of that. By the way, nobody told us the Mexico was open. But you know, thank you very much for this. But I think now it's too late. But for, you know, next time, God forbids, we should know our choices. Joseph, I think the floor is yours. 1 or 2 questions, and I
Yeah,
think we'll wrap it up if there's no more questions.
As the research director of Strategy International, I have to butt in with some statistics. Latin America is about 8% of the population, of the world's population, and suffered more than 40% of all COVID-related deaths. So that's quite at all. And Latin America also suffered perhaps its biggest economic downturn in the century. I do have a 2-part question for our panelists. In the past 5 years, leftist politicians in Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Peru, Argentina won. Do you think that this kind of voting represents a kind of ideological shift in Latin America, or was it a vote that really was against the ruling elites? And the second part of the question, which is of course dependent on the first one, is what could the United States realistically do in order to reset its relationships with Latin America? Because we have seen the Democratic Party with 2 presidents really failing to do any decent inroads in its relations with Latin America.
I said, Javier, you want to go first?
Yeah, I think that I mentioned this briefly in one of my comments. I do believe that social discontent had an effect on elections and brought to power many of the key political figures that were at the center of the opposition, especially in that harsh moment where people experienced lockdowns, or they were fired, or their business were, condemned to go through, impossible conditions to maneuver. And that created a lot of anger, I guess. and resentful, and people realize, I mean, I don't want to sound too local, but I know it's like a very Latin thing. We're very tough place. I mean, it's socioeconomical conditions are not the best, and it's inequality, and you have poverty and security and all that, but still people manage to live through all of those scenarios. You know what I'm saying? And once you get to the COVID era, and you realize that even that when the government is trying, but because you have to actually accept the fact that most governments were doing their best in order to cope with the situation, the weakness of the government or their institutions, the health systems, the economic strength, were not prepared to face such an dramatic scenario. I mean, no country was at all fit for that in 100%, but in Latin America, the case was dramatic. So as things evolved and unfolded for the worst, and economic depression consolidate, and you have lots of people that are feeling very anger and betrayal from the local elite, political elite, and they want to punish them through their votes. I don't know if that exactly represents an ideological shift, but it's certainly a vote of punishment.
Thank you very much. Last word, Dr. Mohammed, the floor is yours.
Look, regarding what is happening in Latin America, I think it's related to the normal political context of these countries. You know, since you have, we can say, democracies in these countries after the end of the Cold War, to be really general in my comment, you always have this, these periods with left-wing government, and after you have right-wing, and after left political parties come back, etc. And it's something normal, I think, in democracies. It's not perfect, of course, but the situation after COVID-19 was a disaster in many countries. I think the exception of this, this balance between right and left, maybe I will be wrong, but I think that in 2024 in Mexico, Morena, the party of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, will stay at the power. The Mexican constitution is not permitting to AMLO, to the president, to be re-elected, because it's only one time 6 years. But I think that someone, Ebrard, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, or Chainbaum, the mayor of Mexico City, will win, because the PAN, the right-wing traditional political party, is in a very bad situation without leader and without leadership and without strategy, and it's the same for the historical PRI. So Mexico, I think, will be an exception to these changes. The left wing will stay, but in reality, it's something normal, and it's interesting to see also how they are different, as I mentioned at the beginning. So I will conclude with that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed, and thank you very much, Dr. Haniel. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joseph, thank you very much for all of you for being here to another webinar of Strategy International. I hope it was informative for you. And I would like to thank again my two colleagues and Strategy International in its totality and its people. It was a great time that we have spent together. And for those that celebrate, Merry Christmas to everybody, and happy holidays with regards to New Year's to come. Be well, be safe. This was a conclusion about Latin America. We're very glad to have you here. My last wish would be that maybe we can get together and just write an article about those things, because it's really important that people get informed about what is happening in the way that was explained, really with regards to the topics, because Latin America really matters. Thanks again, and I really promise we're going to be back with yet again another Latin America, maybe bigger, with even more experts and yourselves, obviously. But we're looking forward to hearing from you more. And thank you very much to all of you for coming in one more time. Thanks again. Thanks all of you for coming. Merry Christmas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Merry Christmas to all of you.